December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning began with sunlight glinting off calm waters and ships at anchor. For the men of the Pacific Fleet, it was just another Sunday. But within minutes, serenity turned to hellfire. Sirens wailed. Columns of smoke rose like black pillars against the sky. Explosions rippled through the harbor as Japanese aircraft screamed overhead, their engines roaring like angry gods. Marine sharpshooter Earl Donovan ran through the chaos, heart pounding, boots striking pavement slick with oil and seawater. Around him, sailors shouted orders that vanished beneath the thunder of bombs. Buildings burned. The air was thick with the bitter stench of cordite and gasoline. In that confusion, one thing was clear: the enemy ruled the sky. He found cover behind a shattered loading crate beside a burning warehouse. Through his Springfield rifle's small scope, Donovan searched the smoky sky. A Japanese Zero descended in a strafing run, guns flashing as it tore through helpless men struggling in the water. Donovan exhaled, aligned his reticle, and pulled the trigger. The recoil jolted his shoulder, but the bullet vanished into distance. A clean miss. At that moment, he realized the truth. He could see, but not far enough. The enemy could hit what he couldn't even identify. The limits of his weapon had become the limits of his reach. And for the Marines at Pearl Harbor, those limits cost lives. As flames consumed the harbor, the foundations of American military doctrine trembled. Across the Pacific, new warfare demanded range, precision, and clarity, things the standard rifle scope could no longer deliver. 3 months later, winter settled over the American mainland. In the heart of Pittsburgh, far from the battlefront, another war quietly unfolded, a war of glass and metal, of precision and patience. Inside a narrow workshop tucked between a hardware store and a watch repair shop, the steady hum of machinery filled the air. John Untold, a German-born craftsman, adjusted the lens of an experimental rifle scope beneath the pale light of a desk lamp. He had spent his life perfecting optics for competitive shooters, civilians who fired at paper targets under clear skies. His instruments were delicate, precise, and far too refined for combat. At least, that's what the experts said. But the world had changed. The letters on his workbench, letters from Marine officers begging for better optics, told him so. They described young marksmen dying on islands because their scopes fogged, their reticles blurred, and their targets vanished in the haze. To Untold, each failure was a wound. He lifted the newly ground lens, studied its edge, then smiled faintly. Precision, he murmured to himself, is not fragile. It's misunderstood. The doorbell jingled as Captain Ross McKinnon, Marine Corps Equipment Board liaison, stepped into the shop. His eyes adjusted to the dim light. On the workbench lay a prototype unlike anything the Corps had seen, an 8-power optical marvel, longer and sleeker than the military's rugged Lyman scopes. McKinnon peered through it, and the world expanded. A distant clock across Liberty Avenue snapped into focus so sharply that he could see the second hand ticking. He lowered the scope, silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Can it survive combat?" he asked. Untold wiped his hands on a rag. "If the Marines can, so can this." But Washington disagreed. When McKinnon presented the design to the Marine Corps Equipment Board, the response came swiftly and coldly. Rejected. Unproven. Too fragile for field use. Bureaucracy favored what was known, not what was needed. The Springfield rifle and its aging scope had survived one war. Surely they could survive another. But reality had other plans. By the spring of 1942, the Pacific had become a graveyard of obsolete weapons. Reports arrived daily from Guadalcanal and Bataan, Marines pinned down by enemy snipers firing from impossible distances. The Japanese, armed with superior optics, could engage at 800 yards. American rifles struggled past 500. The pattern was unmistakable. Bravery was not enough. Technology dictated survival. McKinnon read the casualty lists and felt each name like a personal failure. Then, quietly, he broke the rules. In February 1942, he boarded a train to Pittsburgh carrying no official orders, only conviction. Snow dusted the rooftops as the locomotive rolled past steel mills glowing with wartime fire. McKinnon carried a single goal: to find Untold and give his design a chance to prove itself. When he stepped into that workshop again, he found the craftsman surrounded by brass tubes, glass lenses, and calibration tools. The two men shook hands, soldier and scientist, bound by the belief that one idea could change the balance of war. They began testing in the bitter cold. Targets were set at impossible distances across the frozen Allegheny Hills. Each shot cracked the air like a whip. Through Unertle's scope, the holes grouped so tightly that the targets looked punched by a machine, not a man. McKinnon recorded the data carefully, 5-inch groups at 600 yards, sub-minute accuracy, results unheard of in military testing. Yet when the report reached Washington, it met the same wall of resistance. Too complicated for field use, the memorandum read. External adjustments vulnerable to weather. Manufacture unsuitable for mass production. The verdict was clear, too precise to trust. But McKinnon had already seen what it could do. He knew it wasn't fragility, it was refinement, misunderstood by men who valued simplicity over progress. Against orders, he arranged limited field trials at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. There, the prototype scope was mounted on 2 rifles, a traditional Springfield 1903 and a civilian Winchester Model 70, the favorite of competitive shooters. The Marines assigned to test them came from the rifle range, veterans of the old school. They scoffed at the new optic. Looks like something from a telescope, one joked. Another added, you drop that thing once, and it's done. Then they fired. Shot after shot, the Winchester printed tight clusters on targets at 600, 700, and 800 yards. The Springfield, with its standard Lyman 5A scope, lagged behind. McKinnon's notes glowed with the numbers. The new system exceeded every accuracy standard in Marine records. But Mother Nature had the final say. A coastal storm swept through the range. Humidity climbed, rain lashed the sand, and within hours, the delicate external knobs began to bind. Moisture fogged the lenses. The once smooth adjustments turned stiff. By dawn, the results sheet told a new story. The miracle scope was mortal. Back in Washington, senior officers seized on the failure. We told you so, one colonel said. Combat doesn't need crystal glass. It needs reliability. McKinnon bit back his frustration. He knew they didn't see the larger truth, that flaws could be fixed, precision improved. But in the eyes of the institution, one breakdown erased 100 successes. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, the war machine demanded results faster than perfection could provide. Marines shipped out daily, carrying rifles with scopes that couldn't reach far enough. The gap between potential and performance became a wound that wouldn't heal. For Unertle, it wasn't a technical challenge anymore. It was personal. Every report of a sniper killed by a superior Japanese marksman felt like an accusation. Night after night, he stayed at his workbench, adjusting tolerances by thousandths of an inch. His wife, Emma, brought him coffee at midnight and watched the man she loved disappear into his craft. When the phone rang one cold March evening, it was McKinnon. His voice was quiet but determined. They won't approve it officially, he said. But we're sending a few to the Pacific anyway. There was a pause, the sound of belief outweighing bureaucracy. Then, Unertle replied, we make them perfect. In the following months, the Pittsburgh shop became a secret production line. Each scope was built by hand, every lens polished until it gleamed like a mirror. The internal seals were reinforced, the mounts were strengthened. Even the screws were selected for corrosion resistance. Where others saw fragility, Unertle saw opportunity, a chance to refine the impossible into something immortal. By autumn, a handful of the new scopes, Unertle's 8-power masterpieces, were shipped out under the radar, packed in wooden crates marked optical instruments. Their destination, the Pacific Front. Among those chosen to receive one was Corporal David Rains, a Kentucky marksman whose calm hands and hunter's patience made him ideal for the experiment. When the crate was opened on the coral sands of Tarawa, Rains lifted the rifle as though it were something sacred. Through the scope, the world looked different, sharper, closer, almost alive. He didn't yet know it, but the rifle in his hands would mark the beginning of a transformation, from missed shots and blurred targets to a new age of American precision. For now, though, the Pacific waited, and so did the truth of whether this fragile creation could survive a world built on violence and mud. November 1943, Tarawa Atoll, Central Pacific. The sun rose over coral sands, stained by the previous day's battle. Smoke drifted in thin ribbons across the lagoon, where wrecked landing craft lay half submerged. In the stillness after the storm, Marine Corporal David Rains crawled onto a crumbled seawall, the unfamiliar rifle pressed close against his shoulder. The weapon felt different, heavier, more deliberate. The scope mounted above the bolt gleamed faintly in the light. Inside that slender tube of German-American glass, the war itself looked transformed. He exhaled, centered his reticle on a machine gun nest 2 football fields away, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked once, the echo rolling over the lagoon. Through the optic, he saw a shape slump sideways. A perfect hit at 800 yards. For the first time, the Marines on Tarawa could strike the enemy before the enemy saw them. That morning shot became a whisper that raced through the division. Men who had cursed fancy scopes now begged to see through one. Officers passed binoculars down the line just to witness what the new glass could do. The balance of range had shifted, for a moment. But Tarawa was a gift of geography. Dry winds, open beaches, clear air. The fragile lenses thrived. The next island would destroy them. By the time the 4th Marine Division landed at Saipan in June 1944, the air was thick with salt spray and humidity. Jungle vines swallowed rifles overnight. Coral dust clung to every thread of machinery. Within days, the scopes began to fail. Moisture crept past seals that had seemed watertight in the laboratory. The lenses fogged so completely that some Marines stripped the optics off and fought with iron sights instead. Rains watched his own rifle degrade like a living thing succumbing to disease. The elevation knob froze. The windage micrometer refused to turn. During a firefight near the central ridgeline, he tried to clear the fog from his objective lens, wiping it again and again with his sleeve. The more he cleaned, the worse it smeared. By the time he raised his rifle again, his target had vanished. Moments later, a single Japanese round struck the sand inches from his elbow. He rolled behind cover, angry not at the enemy, but at the instrument that had betrayed him. That night, in his field notebook, he wrote a single line: "Beautiful things don't belong in hell." Back in Washington, the after-action reports from Saipan landed like accusations. Scope performance unreliable. Excessive maintenance required. Not recommended for further issue. The same words repeated in different hands. Officers who had once defended the system now distanced themselves. The term unertl became shorthand for impractical brilliance, an idea too fragile for war. In Pittsburgh, John Unertl received those reports in silence. Emma found him at his bench, the pages spread out before him like autopsy notes. He read every failure as if it were a personal letter from a dying soldier. Then, without a word, he began working again. The noise of his workshop filled the nights, the hum of a lathe, the hiss of grinding wheels, the rhythmic tapping of hand tools. He tested new seals, heavier mounts, thicker lubricants. Each modification moved the design further from its civilian origins, closer to the brutality it was meant to survive. He built small metal chambers to simulate tropical humidity and left his scopes inside for weeks. Most failed. A few endured. He adjusted, refined, tested again. His hands trembled from exhaustion, but his eyes never left the glass. "If precision can survive chaos," he said quietly, "then it becomes strength." Through 1944 and 1945, small shipments of modified scopes continued to reach Marine units in the field. Some worked. Many didn't. Reports became a mixture of triumph and frustration. On dry volcanic islands like Iwo Jima, the optics performed with stunning accuracy. Confirmed kills at 900 yards, enemy snipers eliminated before they could fire a shot. But in the steaming jungles of Okinawa, the same scopes fogged within minutes. The Marines learned to improvise. Some coated their lenses with wax to repel moisture. Others built makeshift covers from waxed canvas or Japanese silk parachutes. The most inventive among them, Sergeant Robert Chin, stitched his own waterproof shroud using salvaged material from enemy uniforms. It looked crude but worked brilliantly. His scope stayed clear through rain and mist while others failed. Chen's field report became a legend among snipers. Protect the glass, and it will protect you. By war's end, only a few hundred unertl scopes had ever seen combat. Their record was uneven, flashes of perfection amid long stretches of disappointment. When peace returned, the Marine Corps stored them away in government warehouses, coating the barrels and mounts in grease before sealing them in wooden crates. The official summary read: high accuracy, low reliability, not recommended for further procurement. John Unertl's health declined after the war. Years of long hours, poor sleep, and constant stress wore him down. Yet he refused to call the project a failure. It was never the scope, he told Emma. It was the weather. History moved on. New wars came. The lessons of the Pacific faded under the noise of victory parades and rebuilding. The crates sat untouched for 5 years, their labels fading with dust. Then, in the summer of 1950, the Korean peninsula erupted in war. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, the Marine Corps scrambled to mobilize. Equipment shortages were everywhere: rifles, radios, vehicles, optics. Quartermasters raided old depots for anything usable. At a warehouse outside Philadelphia, a young supply officer pried open one of those forgotten crates. Inside, wrapped in yellowed paper and dried grease, lay the long, slender scopes stamped Untold Optical Company, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He had never heard the name. But when his commanding officer asked if the rifles were still functional, he shrugged. "They look brand new, sir." Within weeks, those same scopes were shipped across the Pacific once again. This time, the environment was different. Korea's mountains were cold, dry, and windswept, the exact opposite of the jungles that had once destroyed them. The same fragility that doomed the scopes in the tropics now became their strength. The air was clear, the distances long, and visibility near perfect. Corporal Ray Dalton, a Marine sniper assigned to the Busan perimeter, received one of the resurrected rifles in August 1950. It was heavy and awkward, its brass fittings green with age, but when he looked through the glass, he saw the ridgelines of Korea stretch into crisp, endless clarity. Targets that had been faint smudges through standard optics now appeared in razor detail. His first test came on a cold morning when the hills echoed with enemy rifle fire. A North Korean marksman had pinned down an entire platoon from a distant ridge. Dalton crawled to a vantage point, checked the wind, and adjusted the micrometer dials. Movements that once jammed in Pacific humidity now turned smoothly. He fired once. The echo rolled across the valley, and through the scope, he saw the enemy fall. The distance, 940 yards. Word spread quickly through the lines. The old, unreliable scopes were rewriting the definition of range. Marines began calling them ghost glass, weapons from another era haunting a new war. At headquarters, officers reviewed the reports with disbelief. "Untold scopes," one asked. "From the 40s?" But the data spoke for itself. Engagement distances doubled. Ammunition use dropped. Kill confirmations skyrocketed. By late autumn, snipers equipped with the old optics were achieving 90% first-round hit rates under clear conditions. In a war of ridgelines and distance, that accuracy changed everything. The same design that had failed in the jungle had finally found its natural battlefield. When the reports reached the surviving members of the equipment board in Washington, the irony was impossible to ignore. The weapon they had dismissed as too delicate had become the deadliest precision tool in the Corps' arsenal. For the Marines on the ground, it wasn't irony. It was survival. Ray Dalton's kill record rose steadily through the bitter Korean winter. His longest confirmed shot came during the defense of Seoul in early 1951 to 1,200 yards against a Chinese sniper hidden in the ruins of a factory. Dalton lay prone in the snow, breath freezing on the stock of his rifle. He adjusted for wind, temperature, and drop. When he fired, the scope held steady, the image clear. One heartbeat later, the enemy was gone. That shot marked the moment when the Untold scope ceased to be an experiment and became a legend. In the United States, newspapers never mentioned the name. To them, it was just another rifle, another Marine, another small victory in a distant war. But within the sniper community, word traveled fast. Veterans from the Pacific, men who had once cursed those fragile tubes, began to write letters to each other, marveling that the same design had returned from the dead. In Pittsburgh, Emma Untold received a telegram addressed simply to Mrs. J. Untold. It was from a Marine unit stationed near Seoul. "Your husband's work saved many of us. The glass never failed." She read it alone in the quiet of the old workshop. Her husband had died the previous year, never knowing that his impossible idea had finally proved itself. She placed the telegram beside his workbench, next to the last scope he ever built, the one he refused to sell, saying it wasn't perfect yet. The snow outside the window fell in slow silence, each flake vanishing on contact with the glass. Inside, the tools rested, their work complete. Quantico, Virginia, spring 1955. The morning mist hung low over the rifle range as a group of Marines adjusted their scopes beneath the pale sunlight. Their rifles rested on sandbags, barrels gleaming. Behind them stood an instructor, Sergeant David Rains, older now, shoulders still stiff from Saipan but eyes sharp as ever. He watched the trainees line up, corrected a stance here, a breathing rhythm there, and nodded toward the targets shimmering far downrange. The rifles they held were new, but the optics carried an old signature, Untold Optical Company, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. To the young Marines, it was just a brand. To Rains, it was memory, a name forged in mud, rain, and loss. He picked up one of the scopes, feeling its cold metal beneath his fingers. It was heavier, sturdier, redesigned for the new era. The adjustments clicked cleanly. No fog, no binding. Years of modification had turned fragility into resilience. As he looked through it, the world seemed to tighten, distance collapsing into clarity. He smiled faintly. "You made it," he whispered. The lessons of 2 wars had finally crystallized into doctrine. Engineers studied field reports from Korea and reworked every weakness. They sealed internal chambers with nitrogen to prevent fogging, replaced brass fittings with anodized steel, and designed quick-detach mounts that held 0 after transport. What began as an artisan's experiment had become the foundation of modern sniper optics. In classrooms across Quantico, young marksmen learned a new truth. Precision is a weapon of its own. They studied humidity curves, wind tables, and elevation charts, concepts their predecessors had discovered only through failure. The culture of marksmanship shifted from improvisation to science. Every improvement, every lesson, traced back to one man's impossible idea. Yet official history remained quiet. There were no medals for inventors who worked behind the lines. No ceremonies for glass grinders or machinists who never carried rifles. When Untold died in 1951, few in Washington noticed. But in the language of precision shooting, the micrometer clicks, the zero-hold mounts, the long, slender silhouette of modern scopes, his fingerprints endured. By the early 1960s, a new generation of American snipers carried rifles inspired by the work that began in his tiny Pittsburgh workshop. The Vietnam War would test them again. Different climate, same old enemy, humidity. Yet this time, the equipment was ready. The Marines who fought in Southeast Asia carried rifles like the Remington 700 with the Untold 10X scope, a direct descendant of that first fragile design. The glass was stronger, the seals airtight, the mounts unyielding. Snipers trained to respect their instruments as extensions of themselves. Many of them didn't know the full story, that the weapon in their hands was born from failure and perseverance, but they trusted it with their lives. In the highlands of Vietnam, Marine sniper Carlos Hathcock would one day lie prone behind his rifle, sighting a target more than 2,000 yards away through that same lineage of glass. The world would remember the shot. Few would remember the craftsman who made it possible. Back in Pittsburgh, the workshop on Liberty Avenue changed hands. The machines that once sang with the rhythm of precision now sat silent under a thin coat of dust. Emma Untold visited once a year, unlocking the door to breathe the air of the place where her husband had fought his quiet war. The blueprints still hung on the walls, annotated in his handwriting, notes written in German and English side by side. Tighter seals, wider tube, adjust for heat drift. She would run her hand along the benches, tracing the grooves worn into the wood by decades of patience. On the wall above the lathe hung a small brass plaque, tarnished by time. Perfection begins where excuses end. He had made it himself. The world outside had changed. Jet engines replaced propellers. Missiles replaced rifles. Yet in every sniper's hand, that simple equation of optics and courage remained the same. In 1965, the Marine Corps formally reintroduced long-range precision training under what became known as the Scout Sniper Program. The training manuals listed dozens of new instruments and procedures, but one paragraph in the technical section stood out. Optical system based on the Untold pattern, refined for combat durability. It was a small sentence buried in a technical document, but for those who knew, it meant victory for a man long gone. By the late 1970s, Untold scopes had become collector's items, relics of craftsmanship in an era of mass production. Civilian marksmen cherished them for their clarity, historians for their legacy. On rifle ranges across America, shooters still whispered the name with respect, unaware that its origins traced back to the chaos of Pearl Harbor. What had begun as an immigrant's dream to make better glass had evolved into a cornerstone of American military precision. In Marine museums, visitors would see the old Springfield 1903A1 with its long, narrow scope displayed under soft light. A small plaque read, "Prototype Sniper System, Pacific Theater, 1943. Donated by the Untold family." Few paused long enough to read the fine print. But for those who did, it told a story not of immediate triumph, but of persistence through failure. Outside of Quantico, Sergeant David Rains retired quietly. He lived on a small farm in Virginia, where the air was still and the nights long. Sometimes, when the moonlight fell across his porch, he would take out his rifle, the same Model 70 he carried at Tarawa. The scope was dented, its brass faintly green with age, but when he looked through it, the stars sharpened like points of steel. He thought often about the battles, about the friends who hadn't come back, and about the strange connection between the man who built the scope and the men who used it. He never met Untold, but he felt they had fought the same war. One against imperfection, one against indifference. As the years passed, technology leapt ahead, laser rangefinders, night vision, digital optics. But the principles remained unchanged. The best marksmen still spoke of reading the glass, of trusting the lens to tell the truth when everything else lied. That idea, that faith in precision, was the real inheritance of John Untold's impossible dream. Historians often credit wars to generals, strategies, and politics. Rarely do they credit the small hands that built the tools. Yet the history of warfare is also the history of craftsmen who refused to stop improving what others thought was good enough. The difference between defeat and victory sometimes fits inside a piece of glass the width of a coin, and in that difference lies the legacy of a man who refused to accept that too fragile meant impossible. Decades later, when military archivists digitized the old equipment board reports, they found a note scribbled in the margin of a 1942 rejection letter. The handwriting was McKinnon's. It read, "If this works, it will change everything." He had been right. Today, every Marine sniper carries the ghost of that workshop in Pittsburgh. In the clarity of his scope, the precision of his shot, the confidence that distance no longer decides fate. Each trigger pull is a whisper across time, a continuation of a conversation that began between a craftsman and a captain in the middle of a war. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The shot that missed became the reason to build a weapon that would never miss again. Earl Donovan's failed bullet, John Untold's fragile glass, David Rain's first hit, and Ray Dalton's record-breaking shot, threads in the same design of destiny. A design built not from perfection, but from persistence. The idea that began in smoke and failure became America's deadliest sniper rifle. Not because it was flawless, but because it was refused to die. And somewhere, beyond the echoes of history, that gunsmith's impossible dream still looks downrange. Unshaken, unbroken, and perfectly clear.